might be just for you to tell the audience and share a little bit about your personal story, your journey, and what led you to where you are today. And maybe starting or somehow weaving in this story of the cocoa farms in West Africa, because I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. I usually can take for granted that in digital marketing events, I'll be the only agricultural economist. So that's usually like a fun twist to bring to the table. So I started my work in farmer facing projects in East Africa and Central America, really focused on using communication tools with farmers to make food chains work better. And I loved that work. I still have a very special place in my heart for it. But a lot of what I was finding in public-private partnerships is I was seeing a lot of impact being driven on the private side, and that the communication need wasn't just with your farmers, it was actually getting better at communicating all the way through to your consumer. And so I changed gears and went on the road of consumer communication and how do we bring consumers closer to the journey that food goes on, and really cultivate better trust and passion for the food we're eating every day. So my first contact with Nestle was actually on a cocoa farm in Cote d'Ivoire, when I was with a public sector partner working with the World Cocoa Foundation. And at that time, I would have had no idea that I would end up here in Switzerland getting to tell the stories of those cocoa farmers every day. But it's been a really fun ride, and I think something really unique to bring as a marketer and a communicator to have had that on the ground piece. So it tends to surprise people, but I always try to convince them that agricultural economist and digital marketer are not as far apart as they seem.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating, especially when you start getting into storytelling, which we'll talk about, because I think there's many components of the story that you can tell, and having that background in the very beginning of the food journey is a really fascinating perspective. So that's awesome. So could you give us maybe a sense of what your role is? So I know I sort of listed your title, but I think it would be great to hear just sort of your perspective on your role and maybe a few things that you really love about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I lead digital and content, really focused on the Nestle master brand globally. So that's how we engage and produce content for our master brand channels, but also how we empower every country's local team to connect with their consumers and to tell really localized stories. So there is a really heavy focus on social impact, sustainability, purpose-driven storytelling, and kind of bringing the behind the scenes of where food is coming from through to the forefront. So I have a lot of passion for the work. I love food. Food is it's a really special industry to work in because it's so personal. People have such a connection to their own food journey and favorites, and it drives economies and it drives cultures. I feel like every time you land in a new place, the first thing you want to do is have the local food, and it's something really special that has that amount of connection. So I love being able to take the enthusiasm and nerdiness I feel for our food stories here, and really bring that into our consumer connections.
That's amazing. Yeah, no, that sounds, it's interesting how food is really at the center of every conversation. It's the
More than
thing,
ever.
yeah, it's the thing that binds us all together, right? It brings us all together. Um, well, I think one thing I'd love to maybe get into right off the bat is the role that Nestle plays, the brand plays in the lives of consumers, of your consumers. And obviously there's a lot of brands that sit underneath the Nestle master brand, but I'd love to just understand, is there sort of a unifying purpose that all of your brands are sort of globally trying to play in the lives of consumers? And then what role does content and storytelling play in the relationship between the brands and consumers?
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a good question because it's such a huge and varied portfolio. I think there is a real temptation to go everywhere and be everything. But the thing that stuck out the most to me about Nestle when I first joined was for all of the size and scale, we're in more than 190 countries. It actually tends to function locally like a local food company. Where the ingredients and farms are producing, where packaging is happening, how brands are marketed, tends to be really local to each country. Of course, there are some huge global brands like Nescafe that have these big footprints and this kind of unifying idea. But I think that really the special thing about the breadth of the Nestle portfolio is how much it's localized and personalized. Even a brand like Maggie, which is a huge global powerhouse, folks who grew up outside the US will be very familiar. It's something that looks totally different in Cote d'Ivoire. It has more of a seafood base because you're right on the ocean and it's much more akin to the local diet. It looks totally different than what Maggie products would look like in India. So I think that kind of localized, personalized food connection is a big part of every product in the portfolio, no matter what market it lives in. I think the storytelling piece of that is the ability to kind of bring the human side through on that as well. Because like we've talked about before, as a CPG company, you don't always have that immediate connection with consumers at point of sale. You don't control their buying experience. That's going through our partners. So how do you create the connectivity back to your origin story and to that owned brand and owned property? I think comes a lot through where we have opportunities for storytelling and content. In my case, heavily in digital spaces, that's something we talk about even down to the package. How do we use the package to embrace more storytelling and origin stories of the product?
That's fascinating. One thing that just came to mind is, given that you're such a global brand, and I love this notion of empowering local teams to really drive localized stories, and really your role being more of an empowerer of those teams. What are some of the ways that you do that? I mean, I know that's a broad question, but like, what are some of the ways? Because I can imagine that's very challenging. One, because you're trying to drive consistency in what you're empowering them with, whether that be, standardized communications, storylines, whether it be assets, whether it be whatever it may be. Like, how do you manage that? How do you really provide and empower a distributed so many localized teams from your vantage point?
Yeah, I'm a big believer in giving a menu instead of a prescription. So our markets are really different. I'm coming to our Swiss headquarters from the US market, which is Nestle's biggest market in the world. And that team, I'm biased, but that team's incredible. There's so much creative capability and kind of boundary pushing that happens on that team. But there are also teams that function maybe with one communications person, not just for digital, but for a master brand in general. It's hard to believe with such a big brand, but for some countries that can be the case. So I think it's a big mindset shift to think not one size fits all, not how do we make everywhere look like the content package the US has with the largest presence, but more how do we give a menu of kind of every scale of implementation. I think we try to bring consistency in how our values come to life. Like regeneration is a big focus for us in how we develop our supply chains, not just to have zero negative impact, but to actually have a long-term positive impact. And that's a story that can be told in every country, but it won't look the same in every country. So really being able to give the tools, it might be as tangible as like templates, but to encourage and support and kind of be a bat phone when there are challenges or concerns, no matter what scale an individual market is operating at.
Yeah, you have the bat light. So how do you, maybe piggybacking off of that, how do you manage what is consistent versus what is offloaded and each team has autonomy around? And how do you manage that? Meaning, I imagine that evolves over time. You're in constant dialogue with each of the markets, each of the teams, how do you determine as a team what needs to stay consistent, what needs to shift overall across all brands
Mhm.
versus what is in really sort of the control and autonomy of each of the individual teams?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the classic tools like the Nestle brand book and style guidelines stays the same. The nest is the nest everywhere you go. But I think that it's one of the things that we do to drive consistency in a more organic way, rather than prescriptive, also has a lot to do with really like shining a light on incredible work that's happening at the market level. So being able to take cool projects and employee spotlights and different ways of bringing the consumer closer to the farm or the package to see kind of the life cycle of sustainable packaging can go on, really being able to take up some of our favorite projects no matter where they're from and put a spotlight on them. And I've seen a lot of like stealing with pride, a lot of markets taking inspiration from one another and using a format that then they can localize. So one of our favorite kind of running formats in Nestle US, we called Nestle BFFs, and it was two best friends from within the company, kind of like almost playing a dating game. And then we saw that format in our Southern Africa office. We saw it in the Caribbean, because that's sort of like a broader truth, that reality of like your work best friend and the things you go through together and the ways you support each other. So something like that, being able to take inspiration, it's still really localized because the people behind it are real. So when you can take inspiration from a format, but bring your own people and faces and voices to it, I think that that's a really authentic way to create some centralized tools, formats, options that can make it easier to implement, but ultimately it still comes back to the voices and the real people on the ground.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I'm also a big believer in that philosophy of rather than trying to enforce and dictate, really shining the light on things that work, because ultimately people just naturally gravitate to things that work, and they people gravitate to things that they feel are going to help them out. And if you're able to show what's working, what's having a positive impact, what's resonating with consumers, uh, naturally people are going to gravitate towards that and they're going to want to adopt it for themselves. So it makes a lot of sense. So I'm curious in this role. I, obviously storytelling. We talked about this a bit. Storytelling is such a critical role for the brand. And what are the types of stories, either in the last year or year and a half, that you've tried to tell? So, what are the types of stories that you've told, that you're wanting to tell, or perhaps even campaigns that you're proud of over the last year and a half?
Yeah, something I get really excited about is showing the teams that bring new product innovation to life. So something may show up on your shelf or in your Instagram feed that you're interested, you really want to try. But I think it's really compelling where you can see where that actually came from or the journeys that it's gone down. So Nestle has made a huge investment into innovating in plant-based foods. And there have been some really cool products coming out of that, especially the past year, across markets, across Switzerland, everywhere. And so seeing how scientists are actually like working with food to see how we can make something that a consumer is going to love with all plant-based ingredients. And how do you get that taste right and the texture right? How do you move into categories that have never been done that way before? Like Vuna, a plant-based tuna that the team launched last year, and hearing about how they worked on it every day, what their challenges were, taste testing with your cynical 15-year-old daughter. I think like the hearing how the teams go on those journeys together has been an area that I have a lot of passion for, and is a story I love to tell that can kind of take a product and a label that could sit there and just make it feel more connective and make it feel like you as the consumer are also part of that journey. And not every new product is going to succeed. Some are going to flop, some are going to grow. So you're sort of part of this special moment of something being in trial, and where is it going to go from here, and how's it going to develop further? So like that's a story that I particularly really love. I also, like we've talked about, just love my like fellow food science nerds, and there's so much to like geek out on and see what's happening in the development kitchens and how you experiment there. So that's a favorite. And I think another thing that we've talked about is really the role of content in prioritizing value for your reader and your consumer. So I think about a company like ours. We're the biggest coffee company in the world, and you can hear directly from head roasters how they're innovating in coffee, or what you can do with your own coffee to make it more to your taste, or introduce it into your cocktails, or hear from, our Purina veterinarians. If your dog's getting weird and picky about food, what does that mean? What should you do about it? So that really like actionable, tangible value is another area that I think is a area to drive in storytelling, and in hearing those personal experiences of experts that you can connect to and you can apply, because there's such a shortage of time, there's such a shortage of attention. I think I'm the most proud of content or a story that really sticks for somebody because they're thinking of it when they take that product off the shelf, or the next time they're like, this is my life, slowly like closing the door and hoping the dog doesn't get the separation anxiety barking. Like those moments where you're thinking back to being able to connect to like one of the leading vets in the world, that's a very cool like content outcome to have. And that's something that we think and hope is really like investing in trust. It's not necessarily about driving that product, but really understanding who's behind what's getting made and being able to build your trust in Nestle, no matter what the product is.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. I like that as an overarching theme, just this notion of investing in trust, because I think that encompasses both what you were talking about in terms of like the science behind some of the foods, the development process, the innovation process, as well as leveraging your experts within your network to really build trust and add credibility, and really just ultimately provide value to consumers.
Absolutely.
The other thing that I find really interesting is just the storytelling, and the way you're describing it just adds a lot of character and dimension to the product ultimately, because I think it's like, there's so much backstory, and I think what we've seen is that there's a almost a pent up demand. I don't know if it's a pent up demand or if it's just a demand that has emerged, where people want to know. People like are curious about those things. They're asking those questions for the very first time. Everything from sustainable farming to to local sort of food supplies, and people are interested. And so I love that you're bringing that to the forefront.
Yeah, I think the human face of that is a big part of it. And I think we're coming away from an era where there was some kind of fear about acknowledging like humans are behind this, and
Yeah.
that not every product is going to succeed. There was always an instinct of like, well, let's wait and see if it's successful, and let's wait like so long it's not interesting anymore. And now I think there's much more of an appetite to say, let's tell this story while it's happening. And it's okay to say, that didn't end up where we thought it did, that a product totally flopped on the market. But we in the US had examples where like a product release totally flopped, but it ended up being the impetus for a different product development a year later that became huge. That's actually the origin story of Coffee Mate Natural Bliss. It started as a product that like really didn't do well in the market, but it gave insight, and the development process open new questions, and it became something super impactful in its market. So I think that there's a little bit more acknowledgement that it's okay for successes to not be linear, and it's okay to start to open the door that not everything was perfect and omnipotent, that we learn as we go, and that's something we can be a little more transparent and authentic about.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's introducing vulnerability into the process, because it is very vulnerable. I mean, I think that's part of one of the big reasons that people don't do it, right? People don't want to show their failures in front of a global stage. And I'm I want to ask this question, and I'll bring it back, but how do you as a team make those decisions? Because obviously I imagine when you're going when you have this idea of wanting to explore and tell stories, and even if it may set you up where it shows something that didn't work, that's a very vulnerable, and I imagine there's a lot of conversations internally around like the risk of this and how do we manage this, or how far do we want to go out, like are there any practical advice or thoughts for others who are considering this route? Because I know that doesn't happen in isolation, and I know it's a very complex decision to go down that route.
Yeah, it definitely is the product of a lot of conversations. And I think as a content team, we often need to choose not taking the easy path and not for removing something when it's first requested, but instead of saying like, oh, sure, we'll take out that anecdote, saying, okay, what's the real concern here? Let's talk about it. Can we try this? Can we try that? And it really is, I mean, you have, just as professionals day to day, you have like a ton of time pressure, you're multitasking all over the place. There are times that you're really tempted to be like, oh, I'll just say yes. But I think when you start to get a team culture and also like a broader company culture of, believing in failing forward, believing in smart risks, wanting to move towards more authenticity and more transparency. When you're talking about those things a lot and your leaders are talking about those things conceptually, you can almost like see folks in the struggle. And often like marketers, like having to go into a meeting with a lawyer is like not always a good thing as a marketer. I actually feel like our legal team is amazing and will completely differentiate between, okay, what makes us uncomfortable versus what is an actual intellectual property risk. And so let's start to go into some of those spaces that make us uncomfortable. And they know that we're engaging them in the process, so they don't need to be afraid that we're going to go rogue. So I would say, like, whether that at whatever your size of organization is, that might be your legal team, your development team, whoever it is that you're partnering with on that creation, or who's involved in kind of that risk assessment, it is really engagement through the process, as opposed to like trying to slip things by, because you don't want them to feel like they have to police you. You want them to feel like a partner and you're trying to get to the same objective. And getting that conceptual alignment early on, that's like, we do want to do things that make us more uncomfortable. We're both in for that. Now let's talk about where that right line is and just calibrate from there. And there definitely are stories we thought were super compelling and wanted to tell and did not work out. Like, it's not 100% hit rate. But I think investing in those relationships has allowed the content teams and the communication teams to bring more and more openness and candor behind the scenes. It's not a super clear cut path, but it's one that when we got alignment that like, this is important to us as a broader direction, it changes the framing of every conversation. So it's no longer push pull, it's all moving in the same direction and kind of like calibrating as you go.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's some really, so I knew it was a bit of a complex question, but I think there is some really interesting nuggets that you just shared. One being that driving that alignment early on, and rather than thinking about a team that's policing you, you're really everybody's really trying to manage risks, but at the same time really trying to push the envelope. And if there's a cultural buy-in to that's an easier conversation from the beginning. But I think the one thing you also mentioned was finding that nuanced, I'm paraphrasing here, but the line of differentiation between something that's uncomfortable versus something that is truly a risk exposure, I think is really important. And you probably won't get to that unless you bring your partners in early on in the process and are engaging them in that conversation and trying to collectively identify what that line is, right? And that doesn't happen by accident.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like maybe I've ratted myself out as the corporate person today by talking about legal, but it really is like, and it at the point where you have incredible partners internally, I think it's often like a scapegoat or a complaint, but when you build that relationship, it's incredible insight. And I can say truthfully, just in the global role after being in the US, working with the legal team here, within my first 6 weeks, I've had legal pushing me to go farther in a piece of content because they thought we could be braver. So it's a really good time of us all like knowing what the goal is, knowing what we want our brand to represent, and working towards that together and pushing each other in whichever direction you need to be pushed. And maybe usually we need to be a little reined in, but on times where we need a push forward, they'll give us that too.
Yeah. And you mentioned legal, but I think this applies to any partner team, right? Because it also applies from like development as well. Like you want your development partners to be pushing the envelope and also identifying risk for you at the same time, and really helping to identify what that balance and trade-off is. And so I think it's, legal is the obvious one, but I also think it applies to all your other partners that are helping execute.
Yeah, absolutely true. And you'll find it also has so much to do with like personal level of comfort, when we're spotlighting experts who are not in communications or have not had that be part of their job before. And it's really our job to make them comfortable. And we looked for a lot of trust in that relationship too, because if you're putting your name and your voice and your kind of personal story out there as an expert, you're making yourself quite vulnerable as well. So I really want those partners to be able to trust us and know that we are going to do right by what they tell us and what's important to them. So it's absolutely true across the organization wherever we're partnering to bring those stories out.
Yeah, no, that's great. One of the things that we touched on, and I want to go into here is talking about some of the evolutions or innovations in your content over the past 18 months. And one of the things that I found interesting was, we've kind of hit on it already a little bit, which is bringing experts to the forefront. And that can be everything from veterinarians to, in one case, the example you gave me was Coach Ruth. And so,
The cookie coach. Yeah.
yeah, the cookie coach, which is an awesome title, by the way. So I'm wondering if you could maybe tell a little bit tell that story, but within
Yeah.
the larger context of how you evolved as an organization, and how you started kind of changing and evolving quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think our focus on how are we adding value is something that spans teams and is something that was at the beginning of COVID was all the more like rubber hitting the road, is that we need to be here for folks. We need to be here for our consumers and our communities, and that looks different in different ways. But if they're going to spend time with us, we really need to add value back. And so the Cookie Coach was a product from our baking team and digital innovation team in the U.S., where as a new baker, which a lot of people were experimenting for the first time with, you could go onto the Toll House website and choose Cookie Coach. You can still go and play with Cookie Coach, and get the original Toll House recipe for baking with Toll House morsels, chocolate chip cookies. But you could also customize if you had allergies, if you were changing the size of the batch, if you wanted to use different ingredients, you could tell those things to Cookie Coach and get a customized recipe. And then, as is often the case with me, if you're finding, I thought I followed the directions, but these are all coming out like hockey pucks, you had like this troubleshooting process with Cookie Coach that's like, cookies are too hard, cookies are not done, cookies are burning way too fast, and get these troubleshooting pieces of guidance back. And that was very close to my personal consumer experience, which they don't all have to be, but I think you could really see this is a way that's not just delivering like bake with our product, but is really adding value as consumers go on that journey from all different places, and at a time where maybe you can't be baking with your aunt or your mom or your friend who's going to like troubleshoot you in real time, a way of kind of bringing something else into that moment to make it fun and accessible and kind of break down that barrier to entry. So that was one of my favorite innovations that came out of the team. And she's named Ruth after Ruth Wakefield, who was the inventor of the first Toll House chocolate chip cookie. And so that was a really great combination of the digital innovation to bring her to life in a really human way and really equip her to interact with consumers, plus being able to really like meet that consumer need, put that first, and better understand then, based on what consumers are asking and interacting on, what are the roadblocks that they're hitting becoming new bakers, and what else could make it easier for them based on having a better understanding of what they're
I think we might have
I've got you back. Did I?
Yeah, I
I
think
lose you for a
I've
second?
lost a little bit of connection. I'm not sure if that was if that was on my end or, but yeah, I think where I left off was you're talking about just the cookie coach was really just a combination of the digital innovation team, combination of like really rich content, and then leveraging insights that you're getting from the way that consumers are interacting with it to make perhaps like content changes, product changes. So I think that's really fascinating.
Yeah, that's a favorite of mine. And she is just super fun to experiment with, especially if you have perhaps had baking disasters of your own, as
Yeah,
I have.
I'm pretty sure everybody's had baking disasters over the last year. Like they make, making sourdough bread seems so easy, but it turns out it's
I
not.
mean, don't get me wrong, I am not too good to just buy dough, pre-made dough, but here and there, I'll experiment with the morsels and homemade as well.
Yeah, for sure. Um, well, let's see. So how do you, so obviously over the last, I think we probably don't need to spend a lot of time over the last 18 months, but I do think it's really interesting. And you talked about how your content has evolved and how just your approach to innovation has evolved. How do you see content and the types of stories you tell and the types of innovations you pursue, how do you see those evolving as we enter into this new stage?
Mhm.
So what are you keeping an eye on? What are you sort of trying to push forward? How are you just approaching this next phase?
Yeah, I think that the thing that I focused on the most was understanding need states. And so I think the area of technology that I'm the most excited to see kind of continue to move in innovation is personalization, but really personalization by need state. And being able to drive at what's really delivering on the thing that's keeping you up at night right now, which frankly very often could be food or pet related. Those are two that come up quite a lot. And another kind of amazing project that I love within Nestle is called Dottie, which is under the Gerber brand, and that's opportunity for new parents to ask questions not just about Gerber products, but about anything, to licensed nurses and have that like 24-hour helpline. So I thinking about the need state and really delivering and being there in those phases where you're needed the most and you can really add value irrespective of the level of involvement of the product, I think is really exciting and is where a lot of digital marketing innovation can really grow and maximize the ability to have the right value solution from a content perspective at the right time for your audience.
Yeah, and there's so much to dig into there because I think it's in essence it's expanding the role that your brand plays in the lives of
Mhm.
your consumers or your customers, right? Because I love that example of Gerber and just being a resource, being someone who's there at all times to just answer questions, and that may have nothing to do with the product itself,
Mhm.
but it's really just expanding the role. And so how do you bridge that gap? So in this last period, these last 18 months, you've had the ability to expand brands have had the ability to expand what their purpose and role is within the lives of their consumers. Going forward, as things start to maybe revert back to some semblance of normal, and people start to maybe think about their old behaviors and old
Mm.
ways of getting this information that wasn't accessible and that brands played a larger role in, how do you maintain some of those relationships, maintain some of that value that you're providing or that you were able to provide in the last 18 months?
Yeah, I think a big part of that is doing right by every opportunity that you're given. Because in some of those cases, especially where we're really leaning on digital innovation and development, you're kind of making that opportunity and making that connection. But the other thing I would say not to forget as marketers or brand innovators is that like customer service role. And as CPG, it's not exactly like every order touch point. But I think a huge thing that was a learning for me in the US business was just really understanding our consumer services colleagues and the incredible value of what they're doing. One thing when we were really digging into social impact brands and what do consumers think are brands that have a really strong positive impact on the world, their first answer was actually not sustainable sourcing or giving back to the community. The first answer was, I had a great personal experience when I was troubleshooting with a brand or company, which isn't what we would think of as social impact. But if you can't deliver there, you're really not going to have the trust to deliver in any other space either. So being able to have a smooth, easy, personalized, caring, like empathetic consumer services experience is one of the areas that I really loved seeing grow within Nestle, because I think within marketing teams that can often get kind of written off as like the negative, like we don't want to deal with complaints. But it's whether it's positive or negative, it might be, I really miss this flavor that got discontinued. It might be, I had an issue with my package and I'm annoyed. Being able to show up and go like above and beyond in those moments, I think is really critical for having a consumer relationship. And I would say one major learning is to take every one of those contact opportunities really seriously and treat it with value and build your systems to do that too. So I'll always shout out that team in the DC office, because I think it could be forgotten about when we talked about like these grand marketing strategies, but ultimately is one of the things that brought to life consumer value more than any other touch point that we had.
Wow. Yeah. No, it's interesting. You would immediately make that connection, but once the way you're describing it makes a lot of sense, because it's like if it's really credibility, your credibility on your ability as a brand to deliver on these really ambitious
Yeah.
and purpose-driven mission, but if you can't even provide a good interaction with me as a consumer, then that sort of supersedes anything else, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's amazing. So I, so I think that's a really interesting point of really maximizing those touch points that you're receiving from consumers as they're reaching out to you. What are some of the ways? And I know this has been, I mean, it's always been important for brands, but now more than ever, just given the evolving needs and changes in expectations and pain points and friction points that consumers are having along the way, understanding that in real time is really, really critical. And that those reactive channels are important. But I know that a lot of brands have started thinking about how do we be more proactive in how we engage our customers, and how do we create more direct connections. And I know as a CPG brand, that isn't always the easiest for you, just given that you have to work through partners and you're not always there at the point of sale. So what are some of the ways that you're creating closer and more direct touch points with consumers and pulling in insights to make decisions on content and all these other things?
Yeah, I'm a huge believer in the role that insights should play in some of these like fundamental conversations, in addition to when you're developing products. So I think getting rapid insights is super critical. It can't be just on the journey of product development, 6 months, 9 months. It's got to be like that rapid survey, rapid touch point pulse. No matter what the decision being taken is, the message is being able to really create that space to listen to your consumers and have it be an active part of the decision as opposed to retrospective. So that's I'm a big believer in pulling that into parts of the business that maybe didn't anchor heavily on insights before, in addition to the places that it's always really lived, like development.
Yeah, and are there any sort of changes specifically that you've made? So I know one of the things that your team has started to do is started just really pulling in these quick hit sort of real time surveys and research. And I know going from, and again, this is something that a lot of organizations are going through, is looking at this, retrospective 6 months where it's more of a longitudinal study, to getting in the moment insights is very, very different. What are some of the things that you've done that have been successful, and perhaps some of the things that you've tried that haven't been successful?
Yeah, this is one of my favorites. So it's a great kind of place to leave off. But talent is also a really relevant audience to us in addition to consumers. I think that the way we prioritize and engage with talent is really important. And so that's also somewhere we've increased our use of insights. So the world for talent and working has changed so much. And so being able to really track over time and get quick feedback on what's important to talent in their work environment that's maybe different than a year and a half ago, which is a lot, has really changed, and what's a priority has been really important. And that goes from just in the abstract, what's important to you, what are you looking for, rank these things and seeing how that moves, but also really testing the things that we're doing specifically in those messages to understand what makes people want to come work here. And I think one of the big surprises for the team was when we looked at a ton of different things that we were doing as an employer, for both men and women in the talent pool. One of the most impactful things in wanting to come work at Nestlé was our announcement of one-to-one gender pay equity, and being able and willing to make that information public. And I think people did not anticipate that it would have that kind of impact. And internally, it was almost something that was like, do we even really announce it? Don't people just assume and take this for granted? And the answer is no. Like, we as talent do not assume that we can take that for granted. So I think that having that information from rapid insights really changed the internal conversations to how can we do more of that? How can we drive more conversation in the space and bring the transparency that people are really craving here? And that's why last year we actually expanded our gender pay equity announcement to include racial pay equity for underrepresented minorities. And I don't think that that's something that would have happened without seeing the value and importance that the talent pool put in our research on gender pay equity, which was way beyond what people realized was the significance it would have. So questioning your assumptions and then being willing to like go deeper and think about how to build on that further matters, whether it's talent or consumers. But that's definitely one of the uses of insights that I'm the most proud of, because I thought it wasn't just positive for our employees and our talent pool. It actually continued to contribute to an industry-wide conversation about bringing more transparency to those conversations. So insights can do a lot. It can be a really important part of those discussions.
Yeah, no, I love the duality of it. I mean, I think you're gathering insights to drive a conversation internally, but then you're telling stories externally about some of that impact. And so there's a duality there that I think is really important and really highlights the brand and what you stand for. So I know that I need to do a time check here because I think I might be going over.
Diana, are you here to time check us?
I am here. We are here to wrap it up, but I just want to thank you both. It's a fascinating conversation. I love the story of Nestlé taking such a stand internally about pay equity, and then how you're continuing it in the D&I conversation, because obviously this is really important both to employees and also to consumers, because consumers want to support brands that are following their values and they have shared values with. Great conversation, Liz and Jesus. I just want to thank you both so much for being here today. Would love to have you both back. It's been really a pleasure. And I just want to say thanks to everyone who joined for our session today on digital innovation. We hope we will join Brand Innovators later today for our Future of Media Summit at 12 p.m. Eastern, just in about an hour and 15 minutes. We'll be joined by marketing leaders from Pepsi, Dunkin', Nancy Wine, Petco, and many more. So thank you for joining, everyone, and we hope to see you again soon. Bye.